Today we're going to talk about the first part of chapter 10, which is fiscal policy. Second part's on debt, which is sort of part and parcel of fiscal policy. Um, Basically, fiscal policy is one of the two major ways that governments can affect the economy, particularly employment. That's where it's particularly important, and inflation. And the other way is monetary policy. There's fiscal policy and monetary policy. And monetary policy we'll get to in chapter 13. So today we're going to talk about fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is primarily government spending and taxation policy. And there's also something called transfers, which means that basically money is transferred usually from rich to poor, not always, but from one part of society to the other. It's like, tax the rich, give it to the poor. So fiscal policy is based on an aggregate demand and an aggregate supply curve and their intersection. So let's kind of begin by talking about the aggregate demand curve. Now we can think of the aggregate demand curve as basically the sum of all market demand curves. So, we already know about market demand, right? We'll learn that in chapter 3. And of course, then there's supply as well. And we'll get to supply, but let's just start with aggregate demand. So we kind of think of all of the market demand curves as the aggregate demand. Aggregate means all. So we're talking about all of them. Now, how it's determined and, basically, what shifts it and so forth are talked about on page 220, okay? That'll tell us why in aggregate demand we have, for higher prices, there's lower quantity demanded. At higher prices, there's higher quantities. It's not the same reason as for these, but kind of outside of what we need to know right now. So if you're curious about that, page 220 in the text, I think it's like 220 through 222, like that. They'll tell you about it. Okay, so this is our aggregate demand curve, demand for everything in the economy. Notice the small q here, the big Q here. I will say, however, that determinants of it that can shift it at this point are consumption spending. Okay, that's just the market for finished goods, things that people, buy on the market to consume immediately. Investment spending. Okay, and that's basically the purchase of machines and in employment and so forth, capital, to make stuff, the input goods, the factors of production, and also government. We're not going to talk about exports, that as well, but yeah, we're going to talk about that. Also government spending as well. So these are all, spending. All three of these can spend, and altogether, also as I said, there's usually exports there. We're going to talk about that. Basically these form aggregate spending, or what we're talking about today, aggregate demand. Okay, so that's the curve. Higher prices, less output, more output, lower prices. Okay, so that is our aggregate demand curve. That's our starting place. So the next thing we want to talk about is aggregate supply. Now, aggregate supply is fundamentally a little bit simpler. It's a kind of a different looking curve than we'd be used to. Okay, so here, this is aggregate supply, okay? So we want to pay a little bit of attention to this curve. Now, Xiang is going to do this a little bit differently than I am, okay? Just kind of, I think it's best to just think of it my way. It's actually a little bit simpler too. He has like a difference between a long run and short run. Okay, I didn't have you read that part of the book, so let's just forget about the long run, short run. I mean, we're in one time period here. Although that long run and short run aren't really referring to time. So basically, when Chang does it, that I'll just say it goes kind of like this. He has a short run, aggregate supply, a long run, aggregate supply, like two different curves. We're kind of just combining them into one curve. Or at least we're not going to be really talking about anything outside of these two. I mean, yeah, kind of like this. Probably should make that a different color. Okay, so. Ether has short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply, two different curves. But we're going to just combine these into one because these two things here that I'm erasing, they don't really matter. He does have one area in which he uses the analysis using both, like out here. But we're not going to do that, so you don't have to know that. I don't really like that analysis or agree with it particularly. So anyhow, here we go. So this is our aggregate supply curve, and it is going to look like this. Now here's the thing I want you to be aware of. This is like kind of the most important thing to realize with the aggregate supply curve, and that is that here we are at full capacity, okay, or full capacity. Now, that kind of corresponds to our production, possibilities frontier. So we had, good A and good B, but here we're going to think of this as on one axis, like, one axis as all goods, and maybe just, rockets, doesn't matter what. So you can make all other goods, or you can make rockets. This is, the most that society can produce. This along here is the same as along here, this and this, okay? And the reason I'm bringing that up is because this is the most that society can produce, this quantity. And this is mostly thought of in terms of labor, because, it's only a certain number of people in the economy able and willing to work, but also capital, okay, and I include land in that, all, sort of non-human inputs, including skills and so forth. So do think of it in terms of both of these, but it's often thought of just in terms of labor. And so this is it here. This quantity right here, that's the maximum society has available. And what I kind of want you to be aware of, okay, these are the words you're probably used to hearing in the news when you think about economics and so forth. These are the two key words. So this is aggregate. So price here, when we're talking about price going up, what we mean is inflation. Okay, all prices are going up in the economy. So that is inflation. And here we're talking about what we really mean by this is employment. Now, it's a little confusing because I have this Q, so, employment means quantity of output. So the more workers, then the more stuff there is. The more people there is making stuff, the more stuff, and the more capital, the more machines as well. Okay, so labor, capital. So think of Q sort of in that way, because these are the two real key things, inflation and employment. And that's kind of why this aggregate supply curve is important. Okay, so now and oh yeah, so full capacity. So we have full capacity here. So then what's this? Okay, this is excess capacity. So, this is full capacity here, and getting back to that production possibilities frontier, we're inside of it here, okay? That means that society could be producing more here, in here, and anywhere here, okay? Just like this, for example. At this point, there's more resources available than are being used. There are workers who could work, there's factories that could be used in production that are closed, there's machines sitting around gathering dust that could be used. Okay, again, it's usually thought of in terms of labor and employment, okay, but it could be employment of capital or employment of labor. And this is kind of the main thing, but it's important to know this also could be employment of capital, don't forget that. But because people are really concerned about employment of labor, people having jobs, we tend to think of this in terms of labor, and also, of course, inflation, right? Okay, so now that we've established aggregate supply and we got this, excess capacity, people are out of work and would like to work. They could be working, but they're not. So society isn't producing as much as it could. Again, same thing with machines and so forth. Okay, so I think we are ready, without further ado, to now talk about the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve. Okay, so now we have our aggregate demand curve. Okay, so aggregate demand, just remember this, it's spending, okay? It is spending. The more people are spending, the more stuff they're demanding. Okay, when you have to buy something, you're buying something, but you're establishing a demand for that thing. Okay, so the more people are going out and buying stuff, the greater is going to be aggregate demand. So this is spending by consumers, consumption, just buying stuff, investment, buying stuff to make stuff. I think of it as machines, capital, but there's also government. And today, what we're talking about is really government. Okay, government by building roads, giving money to schools, building hospitals, and investing in research, whatever that government is spending money on, that is stimulating aggregate demand. Now, certain kinds of government spending can also stimulate aggregate supply, but we're not going to talk about that right now. We'll get to that. So so spending increases aggregate demand. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I just want to be aware of that. That's kind of the primary thing. It's not the only thing that influences aggregate demand. The spending is one. So before we get too much further, let's talk a little bit of this. So right here, basically, society is at full capacity. Okay.
I'm gonna send you
aggregate demand is equal to full capacity. All of the spending in the economy is equal to society's output at full capacity. Okay, so, here everything's hunky-dory. And we're going to get to what happens if it shifts this way a little bit later. But let's now talk about the main thing that macroeconomics is about. You'll remember from the pre-quiz, why was macroeconomics invented? It was invented to reduce, now this is going to be unemployment, okay? N means employment. Okay, so unemployment. It's not the way it's spelled, but you want unemployment. So if there is unemployment, what government wants to do is to reduce it. So so guess what? If we're here, and I'm going to just take it out here a little bit just to give us a little bit more visibility of this. So for here, we have unemployment. So, I'll see how this. This is aggregate demand. This is what Keynes was saying. Okay, people weren't spending enough money, and there was not enough investment demand. Okay, insufficient demand to hire all of the people who wanted jobs. Okay, so basically, consumers weren't spending enough money, so firms were kind of like, well, consumer spending is down. Okay, that means that prices are down, and that means that profits are down. Okay, so if this happens, then firms don't spend money on investment. They don't hire people. They don't, employ factories. They don't demand capital. They don't hire capital. And we get in kind of a vicious cycle here, because when firms are not investing in the economy, they're also not hiring workers. Okay, and when they're not hiring workers, then we have unemployment. That means that workers have, there's a lot less money to spend. So because a lot of workers are out of work, wages are lower, and so forth. So then they're not spending, and they're not spending. Okay, consumption's down, prices go down, there's less demand for stuff, and then firms, there's kind of expectations, expect less profit, so they don't produce, because they're saying, well, I can't make a profit like this, nobody's going to buy my stuff. So they go out of business, they cut back production, they hire less, and it's kind of almost like it gets into a vicious cycle. And especially in the 1930s, that's where all this was invented with the Great Depression. Keynes came along, of course, he was British, and English specifically, and was like, well, how do we end this? And this was his answer: we need to increase aggregate demand. So how do we do that? We can't make people invest, we can't make firms invest, can't make people buy more stuff, and they don't really have the means to anyhow. So we need to have, so we had I and C again, we need to have I plus C plus G, okay, is going to equal aggregate demand. We need to have government take over. Now this is something I want you to be aware of. This is not sort of neutral philosophically, okay? This is not ideologically neutral. This is an ideology, okay? Keep in mind that microeconomics, also called neoclassical economics, is, so this is important to know, neoclassical. In chapter 5, which we're not covering, Chiang calls it classical. Okay, there's a lot of reasons I don't like that word, which is something we're not going to talk about this term, but just keep in mind that neoclassical economics and microeconomics are like, of course it's very complex, but they're essentially the same thing. Okay, for this class, they're the same thing. If I say neoclassical, that means microeconomics. So that's micro, and they were basically like, microeconomics is saying, well, we don't need the government. The economy can take care of itself. Study a microeconomics textbook. That's what it's talking about. That was the whole point. Adam Smith said that, and microeconomics said that. They said it for very different reasons. Now, Adam Smith was classical. This is neoclassical. It's one of the things I don't like this word classical to describe microeconomics, because what Smith is saying is not microeconomics. It's very different, but they both agreed that a reduction in government interference in the economy was the best thing for it. So up until that time, they were saying, well, markets adjust, the economy takes care of itself. Give it enough time, and this will just adjust on its own. In the long run, that's why I don't like this long run curve idea, because Keynes said, well, in the long run, we're all dead. That doesn't matter. You can't just sit and wait. We need to have government in the economy. So that's why macroeconomics is fundamentally, the micro, as I was in the quiz, has invaded it a lot. Macroeconomics is fundamentally government, okay? And we're seeing that here in most cases. Whenever there's a recession or a depression or unemployment, then governments like immediately start doing this. This is what they do. 2008, COVID. This is like what we're talking about here, okay? So this is macroeconomics government. This is no government, microeconomics or neoclassical, okay? There's an ideological split here. So two different philosophies. Okay, so government starts to spend. That's number one. Okay, government starts to spend. And when government starts to spend, then aggregate demand starts to grow because government's spending more money. Okay, and what that means is that who gets that money? Like, well, people government is employing, firms the government does do contracts with. Okay, they all start getting more money. COVID payments, classic, just COVID payments. Okay, you all have more money, you're all spending stuff, you're increasing government demand. You're increasing aggregate demand. Same thing with firms. If governments want to start making like a project to do green, start manufacturing windmills, or increasing power stations, increasing education spending, they're hiring more teachers for that. If they're doing like a green policy, they're hiring more and more workers to produce green energy. And they say, well, that'll unemploy people in the fracking industry. Well, they can go and work making green stuff instead. Okay, that wouldn't be a change in spending per se, but that would solve these fears of unemployment from green policy. It's going to be employing a lot of people to do this. It would increase employment. So building roads, construction, whatever, homes, whatever government wants to spend money and do, it's giving money to people to do that, and they're spending money. And there's something else which we're not going to cover really, but there's something called the multiplier. Okay. I don't expect you to know this, so don't get too worried about it, because I'm not going to tell you very much detail, but pretty much, this worker gets $1,000. The worker goes, puts it in a bank account, and what do banks do with money that you put in your account, checking account, savings account? When you open a checking account, they're lending that money to other people. You're giving them a free loan, basically. So someone puts $1,000 in. That bank lends that $1,000 to somebody else. They have $1,000 more dollars. That's another $1,000 of aggregate demand, and they're using it to buy stuff, which demands stuff from firms so they produce more, or it's directly invested into more production, so more gets produced. They take that, and when they get the loan, they take that $1,000, put in another checking account. That creates another $1,000. That goes on and on infinitely. Okay, that's called the multiplier or the money multiplier. Okay, but it's not just money; it also increases demand for everything. Now, there's something called a reserve requirement. There's a few other things that they can do. So banks can't, so it'd be like, with a reserve requirement, banks can't just take your checking account and lend all of it. They can take like $100 and lend like 90 of it, something like that. So they lend 90, someone else has 90, put in another account, then they take 10% of that, which is 9, so it's like $81, they lend that. So that can slow that down a little bit. But the thing to keep in mind is there's a money multiplier. When government spends, it doesn't just spend, it multiplies, okay? Throughout the economy, increases aggregate demand. So we can get back to full employment, okay? This is something, unlike microeconomics, this is something that's like in the news. I know 2008 was a while ago, but COVID is very recent. You heard about all this recently. COVID, there's massive unemployment, from the COVID shutdowns and business closures. Well, that's why the government said, well, we'll give these COVID checks to people, because it increases aggregate demand and the economy working again. And it did, okay? Inflation is a complex issue. We'll get to that, but you may be wondering about that, but don't worry about that right now. We're just talking about aggregate demand. Okay, so we have, now this is very important. We got to know this, okay, right here. Really got to know this. Do it in green, okay? So when government does this, expands aggregate demand through spending, it's called expansionary fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so there are more than one way the government can do this, not just spending. So we had spending, okay, and we kind of talked about that, but there's something else they can do. They can also lower taxes, okay? So when they lower taxes, what happens? People have more money because they have to pay less taxes, so they demand more. Firms have higher profit margins. They know they'll make more profit, so they invest more. That increases aggregate demand, lowering taxes, okay? And lastly, we have transfer payments. Transfer payments are what they used to call welfare checks, and we used welfare in another context in the first part of this class. Oops, all wrong. So, what I call now SNAP, EBT, and so forth, those are welfare, what we used to call welfare payments. Those are transfer payments, okay? They're taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. There's more taxes on the rich and giving it to the poor. And what that does is that increases aggregate demand. Even though it's a transfer, it just goes from rich to poor. So you're kind of like, well, if it's just going from rich to poor, then why is there more demand? There's no more money in the economy. Well, that's because poor, and this is something to remember, I want to remember this, poor spend more, okay? Poor spend more. We give a rich guy money, and he's going to, maybe spend 10% of it. He gets another $1 million, and, so he spends $100,000. The rest he goes and invests. He buys stocks, he buys bonds, he starts a company, buys capital, okay? It's not increasing, consumer demand, unlike a poor person. If you gave them $100, they spend 90% of it. They save maybe 100% of it. So all of it goes out into the economy and get demanded. So it's poor people have more money, they spend more. And also, keep in mind, it's consistent with something you said at the beginning of the class, why fairness is not fundamentally different than efficiency. And that is because poor people get more utility, other things equal out of money than wealthy people do. So there's more welfare in society as well, okay? But that's not a macroeconomic point, that's a micro point. But this is a macro point. They spend more. So transfer. So this is it. These are our big three here. Expansionary fiscal policy, government spends, rate lowers taxes, transfers. Bam. We are done with part one. Okay, so now we're going to talk about something else. Now we talked about before, where we had sort of like unemployment, increased it with government. Okay, that was pretty much Keynesian economics. Okay. As much as people try to say this is dead, governments pretty much always do this as soon as trouble comes in terms of, recessions or unemployment. So that was Keynesian economics. Now, as I mentioned, there's also its sort of opponent, and that is, classical economics, okay, or microeconomics. Now, what they're saying is that if government expands, and let me just say that it's not the case. I don't want to be confusing. It's not the case that neoclassical. It's a complicated term. What neoclassical means. It's not the case that Keynesian economists or those types don't disagree with this. Okay, per se, there's a lot more complex issues. Okay, so most Keynesians don't necessarily disagree. Okay, they don't necessarily disagree that the following is true. Therefore, this is at full capacity, remember, okay? Full capacity, excess capacity. Okay, I should just write that out. Okay, so at full capacity. So what happens if there's expansionary fiscal policy? There's expansionary fiscal policy when we're at full capacity. So let's say at this point, at full capacity, let's say that spending starts to increase, okay? Now again, spending could be in any of these three categories. Consumption, savings there. We want, it's not quite right. Consumption plus investment plus government or spending. So it could even be that consumers or firms are spending more too. So if either of these, we'll talk about for the moment, government starts to spend, but it could be any of these. You know what? Let's not just talk about government. Let's just talk about this in any of these. Okay. Then we have aggregate demand shift out from the kind of at full capacity. There is full employment. This is a good thing you can talk about in the news and stuff. Also, full employment. Let's say aggregate demand increases. Okay, so we have AD, not AD1. Aggregate demand increases. Here's aggregate supply, right? Well, what starts happening here? Prices go up. So if we're at full capacity, and then aggregate demand rises or continues to rise, then what happens? Prices go up. This is inflation. Now, don't get me wrong, according to this graph at least, while we were going up here and increasing employment, there was also inflation. Prices were also going up, but we're not too worried about that because, we're increasing in employment. But here, we have higher prices. And is there more employment as aggregate demand is going up, as there's more spending? No, okay? There's no change in Q, okay? No change in N, which is employment, okay? But there are higher prices. So if we're at full capacity and spending increases, which is aggregate demand, more and more people want stuff, there's nothing more the firms can make. All right, everybody's employed. All machines available are employed. So prices just get bid up. Okay, it's like there's 10 goods. Okay, and people had been happy with 10 goods. The prices that they were at their income levels, and all of a sudden there's more spending. So there's more demand. More money is chasing those 10 goods. So what do firms start doing? They start raising, it starts like a bidding war. They start raising the prices. Okay, everybody wants it. Well, how much are you willing to pay? Well, I'll pay a little bit more. Okay, and someone else is like, well, I'll pay a little bit more. It starts raising prices. Okay, so this is something that, neoclassical economists are concerned with. However, I don't want to be unfair or I want to get this right. Complex area. Okay, obviously not going to try to go into that, but for example, here I'm at UMKC. Actually, this is the home of modern monetary theory. Or its academic core. They actually agree with this, that if we're at full capacity and aggregate demand increases, we'll have inflation. So, and then MMT is kind of linked to Keynesianism, kind of. Not, it's complex subject. Okay, so that's what I want you to be aware of here. If we're at full capacity and demand increases, what do we get? Inflation. So now the question might be, and this is something that MMT is really big on, is if we have inflation, then what can government do? Okay, now there's a lot of monetary stuff. That's kind of the more neoclassical way of looking at it. But there's also something called contractionary fiscal policy. So we had expansionary fiscal policy, Now we have contractionary fiscal policy, and that's trying to bring this back so that we can lower prices and lower inflation. This is my term for inflation, okay? PI. So how do we do that? Very simple. We can now, we have this problem, increase taxes. We knew that lowering taxes, okay, lowering taxes increased aggregate demand. So raising taxes lowers aggregate demand, takes money away from people, takes money away from firms, they have less profit expectations, they produce less, people buy less, okay, the economy contracts. So that is a way to control inflation, is through lowering taxation. And it even rhymes. Okay, that's actually pretty much it for this. Except to say, there's one thing I want to kind of close with here. You know, this inflation, here, you see this, prices are going up, no change in quantity. Well, what's also happening, because prices are going up, people are demanding more, is that there's starting to be more and more demand from workers in each industry. You know, each industry wants to make more stuff because people are demanding more stuff. You know, they have the 10 cars and those prices have gone up, but they kind of want to make more, so they start demanding labor basically from other firms. Firms are demanding from each other, and guess what? You know, 10 cars, let's say 10 workers, just to be simple, firms want those 10 workers, they had one of those 10 workers here, everything was kind of in equilibrium, but all of a sudden they want more than 10 workers. So they start bidding, different firms are bidding on those 10 people, like, oh, you know, work here, I'll pay you more. And hey, no, work here, I'll pay you more. Wages get bid up. So wages, every time prices are going up here, wages are also going up, you know, theoretically in equal proportion. So it's kind of like, no one's really, there's winners and losers, but nobody's really worse off here because prices are higher, everything they pay more too. So really, this kind of inflation doesn't actually matter. So you're thinking, well, why then are they worried about inflation? And, you know, theoretically, there's no reason that they should be. So, you know, this whole thing where economists talk about inflation here, it's like, well, we really shouldn't be worried about it, okay? So I will really what's really going on when inflation is, if there is inflation that we should worry about, which is not here, even though most economists, or at least many, think we should, I would argue falsely, is aggregate supply has shifted for some reason. Say global climate change has destroyed farm productivity. There's less to consume in society overall. Well, if this goes, okay, so we're on this aggregate demand curve. If aggregate supply shifts, I know it's getting messy, we go here, okay, we had been here, okay, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, then prices rise, okay, and there's not much government can do about this. And MMT, there's big argument about the COVID checks when there was inflation a couple years later. Well, all of them said, well, it's because, you know, we raised aggregate demand too high and there's inflation. And like MMT's like, no, it's because there are these supply chain, you know, blockages, and, you know, there's all these problems getting supply out especially with all of the new demand, and you know, workers were restricted from working and so forth, and all these gluts. And then there's other reasons, like firms start saying, oh, well, yeah, okay, prices are going up, so I can raise prices, and everybody knows that there's a reason for that. So then they're kind of thinking with other firms, so we can raise prices. So we start getting inflation. And when firms start doing that, kind of raising prices, because there's an aggregate supply shock, you know, beyond even their increased costs, because they know they can. That's called a post-Keynesian cost push price pull inflation. Okay, so this is what MMT said caused inflation. Now remember, in one of the questions before, and I think those who took the quiz did pretty good at getting this, is that when there's less supply, that's just kind of bad for society. Okay, period, other things equal. And there's not a lot government can directly do about it. Far more complex problem, completely understudied by economics. Okay, that concludes part 2. Okay, so now this is our last topic, part 3, third and final part of this lecture. Talk about changing aggregate supply. Okay, and we're talking about fiscal policy, so we're talking about government here. Okay, we're not talking about firms and consumers. That's like more of a micro topic, anyhow. Can government change aggregate supply? Now, much like we talked about, I'm not sure how many of you actually got this, but I did talk about this. Production process. It's basically exactly the production possibilities frontier all over again. We'll just, instead of having, rockets and cars, we'll just have all goods and rockets, just to kind of make clear this is all goods in the economy. And what I had mentioned is that we're on this PPF, we can have workers go from making finished rockets and all their finished goods, and instead making the machines and other resources, including research and development and so forth, that make those things. So we can go here, okay, this is T equals, and let's, we're no longer this is, okay, this is for this, we're no longer in this one time period now. Okay, so we have like, T equals 10 years, all right, so we have T naught, T1, T2. So here on this curve, we're at T naught, this time period naught. Now in T1, what they can do is take resources, workers, and machines to make other machines. I like calling capital machines. It just kind of helps me to think of it, and then thinking there's other things that it can be too. But it can also be land and so forth, if there is land to reasonably use. So anyhow, we go into the production possibility curve. We make less finished goods, okay? So we have these finished goods here, and here we're making capital goods, okay? This can also be R&D, labor, and other resources. Instead of making the finished final goods to consume, they're making the capital goods and other, we can develop, basically capital goods, because I'm calling basically everything isn't raw labor capital. And R&D is a part of capital here, to be able to make more later. So after, say, another 10 years, then each time period is 10 years, we're saying. So we have, okay. Yeah, so each time period is 10 years. Okay, so we had T naught, we've been, say, here for 10 years. And then this T1, this investment, took 10 years, and then in T2, we're out here, T2, okay? And this could last longer than 10 years. This could have lasted longer or shorter 10 years. It's really, I'm just saying 10 years is the time that it took for the investment in capital to start resulting in more finished goods. The actual time period is, it's this theory here, it's not that important. So, the idea would be, at least from Xiang, it takes a long time. Okay, so we could do like this, okay? And so we have T naught, T1, and then T2, let's say 10 years later, and we've shifted the aggregate, government has shifted the aggregate supply curve out, by investing in scientific research, investing in education, investing in green energy production. So, aggregate supply, clean air, feeling good about the environment, more natural resources to enjoy, those are all aggregate supply increases. Okay, so, we have this moving out here. We've increased aggregate supply. Now, what it looks like is, okay, great, prices are lower. That's kind of supply and demand thing, as Xiang points out, and I don't disagree with him. In reality, because there's all this investment and so forth, although, I don't know, when in here, this is Xiang's point at least, then aggregate demand has also increased. So it's basically like, this was the initial price level, price not, and then price one, if aggregate demand hadn't increases, but if it does increase, then we'd be up to price not again. This isn't exact. It's not like there'll be no change in price. Your textbook's argument, which is not in the part that I've assigned, is going to be that aggregate supply increases, and you think price decreased, but from it's going back. It's going out from here to here. Okay, we have this aggregate demand curve. Price went from here to here. New aggregate demand curve. Boom, goes up to here. Something like that. But the salient feature is when government invests in capital, then we have an increase in quantity of goods and services. The standard of living has gone up. And more goods and services to enjoy, supply increasing, remember, as you guys pretty much got, is other things equal a good thing. Okay, just takes some time, at least in theory. Well, I suppose it would no matter what, right? Sometime. Okay, so aggregate supply increases from government spending or government investment. Okay. More stuff. Other things equal.